know me and may know Nola. I'm going to do an introduction later. I thought I would start really by if anybody wants to share where they're coming from, a little introduction of themselves in the chat, that's fine. I am actually today in a different location. So speaking of work from anywhere, I love that I can be in southwestern Ontario today. So normally I would just acknowledge the land in Toronto, Treaty 13 and many nations, but today I'm in a different area, and so it's I love that it's in the Chatham-Kent area near Rondo Provincial Park. And it was interesting because years ago it was inhabited by what they called Three Fires Confederacy, the Ottawa, Potawatomi, and the Ojibwe. And so I've been also trying to learn about some of the history here. So I do want to thank the Indigenous peoples for this beautiful part of the world that I'm at. I'm near Lake Erie, so I've been able to walk to the water. I'm very blessed. And I think it's really important that we acknowledge that, we're all connected and that we do need to take care of Mother Earth as well. And I was thinking about how that links to life and work as well, because so much of the challenge with commuting to an office location can add so much, anxiety and other things as well. So we're going to have a great chat today. Feel free to share where you're from. Later on, we will have an opportunity for some questions. So if you think of anything, don't, just put it in the chat as we're chatting. But I do want to welcome our guest today, Nola Simon. And it's so interesting because I think about, you know, the whole social media world, and that's how I meet so many incredible people. So as much as I want to be in a room with people and in an office, I really love that. I'm going to put the speaker view on. I really love that we can meet people online and then connect with them in another way. So Nola is a futurist and has a lot of expertise in the what I call the hybrid remote, but really balancing our lives as it relates to the structures and systems of work. And so over the last several years, she has really built her expertise. And I'm so excited for her to be here today. And as we mentioned in the description, we're going to try to dive into issues like how does trust relate to work life and hybrid and remote work and this whole return to office situation, like we're hearing about Amazon. And then how does self-trust relate? And I'm really interested about that for myself. And also just, psychological safety. What are some of the things that we're learning? And then where can we go? Like, how can we redesign the workplace so that we don't have to really ask for this? And I have a little story to share later about, you know, uh, what, should I have to seek forgiveness? Because I have done a few things where I've just, made a decision myself without asking for permission to design a beautiful workplace. So here we go. First of all, I just want you to quickly introduce yourself a little bit more so people get to know you, but also what led you to this work today? And I know it could be a long story because you have lots to share, but just like, how did you end up really becoming, your mission in a way to really open up the dialogue and change, the perspectives around hybrid remote work?
So, thank you. I actually worked for a large insurance company. In my career, I've worked actually for five major corporations. And when I actually had kids, I never moved, but my commute grew to be like 2 hours each way. So I live up on Lake Simcoe. Chippewa Nation, I think, is up here. And that wasn't the type of mother I wanted to be because I was really only seeing my kids for 1 hour a day, honestly, some days it was really bad. And so it grew out of that because I advocated for myself. And so I started this in 2000. Honestly, I started in 2010. I had to change jobs to even get into a team that had access to VPN and could actually even connect with the desktops that we had at the time. And so for 10 years, I really advocated and, worked every version of hybrid remote that existed and made every single mistake that goes along with that. And when my job was actually restructured in 2020 at the end of the pandemic, when I sat back and I considered what type of work I wanted to do, I realized that the most meaningful work that I had ever done was not actually anything that was in my job description, but the extra work that I had really done to facilitate hybrid remote. And I realized that I saw an opportunity that that's how the world of work was going to go. And lo and behold, 4 years later, we're still talking about it. I survived a return to office mandate in 2013. And if I hadn't survived that return to office mandate, I wouldn't be doing the work that I'm doing right now. So for me, there's always a give and take of how um, flexibility is going to happen in the office, and a lot of it has to do with the self-trust and the stories that we tell themselves.
Yeah, and I think it's so important that we so many people are exploring the concept of trust as it is in the workplace. And we talked a little bit about a trust report that had come out, or the impact report. But how, how is it that, so that an Amazon story everybody's been talking about, that there's all these mandated
Yeah.
return to office in a lot of these large organizations. And I've even been seeing some recruiters who are leveraging that and saying, hey, all this amazing talent is going to be out there because flexibility and the ability to have this ability to work from home or another location, maybe not 100%, but to have that is so important to people. And if they don't, there's going to be this exodus from these organizations. I don't know if that's a reality. We'll have to see. But what do you think about that? Like, because how do you build first, like, how do you build the trust? I mean, I don't think it's obviously an office mandate and policy that says you must be in the office, because it doesn't guarantee any increased productivity or anything like that. So, yeah. So, what are your thoughts on this, like building trust and designing this type of environment that will help with these issues?
Okay, so let's start a couple of points about trust. So first of all, I like to start with a definition of trust because there's actually more definitions of trust than there are of love in the world. It's a really hard concept to really kind of explain. So it's useful to start with being on the same page of what trust actually means. And I like the definition that Rachel Botsman, she's a professor at Oxford, she studies trust. She defines trust is a comfortable relationship with the unknown. So, in order for you to trust, you actually have to be dealing with things that you can't see, that you can't define, and that you can't control. And so, when it comes to the concept of building trust, that's actually a red flag, that phrase, because if you are trying to build trust, that means you're trying to control. So, you want to use language of let's foster trust, what's creating trust, what strengthens trust, what encourages trust, because trust is contextual and you can only be more trustworthy. So you can only uh, control how you trust and how you show up, and trust it evolves from there, basically. So starting with those concepts.
Wow, I love that. And because interesting, when I said the word build earlier, I did hesitate before I was
Yes.
about to say it, which is, and that's part of it is um, what could be different for so many individuals. So even is there, is it a universal thing? And I guess that's where the concept, the self-trust, because without that, how can you then open up and create trust with others, right?
Right.
So,
So trust really is like credibility and empathy and how you are showing up reliably, right? And you have personal control of all of that, right? What makes you credible? What makes you reliable? What makes you empathetic, right? So you can control all of that, and nobody else can, right? And trust is also given and earned. It's not taken, right? You can't force somebody to trust you, right? So
mm,
what's happening with the mandates, to segue back into your question about what's happening with Amazon and 3M, and yesterday they announced Starbucks, is these are control narratives, right? And they are telling a narrative that people aren't necessarily finding credible or respectful, right? Particularly the Starbucks story is really interesting because they just hired a new CEO who's actually commuting 3,000 miles, and he's now mandating that everybody has to be in the office except him. So that's a really hard narrative to sell as an executive because, well, why don't you have to actually follow what you're saying, right? And that again comes back to like the mindsets and worldview. I'm constantly telling people that a lot of what happens with hybrid remote is really foundational into the personal leaders' worldviews and mindsets, right? How does the world work? How do they perceive the office, right? And why do they perceive it that way? So what's happening is leaders are often the story is we want you back in the office because we want you to be more productive. We want us to be more collaborative. We want to be more innovative. And what the problem with is that is people actually aren't rewarded for already doing that work anyway, right? So like, does your job description actually reward you for being innovative? If you come with a suggestion about how things can be done differently, is that welcomed? Or are you shot down and be told this is the way we've always done it? We're not going to try anything new, right? If you're in the halls and you're talking to somebody, are you rewarded for being collaborative? Or are you told to get back to your desk and go do your work and stay in your own lane? Right? So what's happening is they're spinning all of this narrative, but the reality of the day to day isn't filtering out. And I mean, there may be some companies out there that are great at collaboration and recognizing innovation and working with that employee input. I'm not saying that there aren't, but in my experience, I was often told, stay in your lane, don't come up with new ideas. That's not what you're paid for. This isn't your salary. This is not your job, right? And so that narrative doesn't track for a lot of people. And that's where you start to think of the leaders as not being credible and not being trustworthy.
wow. This is amazing because when I read that that situation, I thought, oh my gosh, that whole walk the talk
Yeah.
leader and all of those things came to mind. And Claudine's putting some comments in the chat as well that it just doesn't work. But I think that I something I picked up on what you were saying about the control,
Mhm.
and I think this is a really important thing that you mentioned because that is the whole point. When I look at like results only workplaces, that whole row
Mhm.
concept, which makes sense to me, doesn't matter where, even when, we have
Yeah.
this 9 to 5, like the world is becoming global. So the different time zones, like we've proven over and over that work can be done collaboratively in
Yep.
different time zones. I've worked for a global company that had offices all over the world and 80 something thousand people. I've worked for a national, multinational. And, so we did have those remote and travel and lots of meetings, before it was conference calls, which wasn't the
Yeah.
best before video. But
And now it's
so
asynchronous work where we're not
yeah,
even working at the same time, but we're still making progress.
yeah. So it just seems so backwards. It's like we're going back in time, as opposed to progress. I know there are pockets of progress, but I think overall, and maybe it's a lot of issues, Nola, that we see that, we go forward, then we kind of go back a bit until there is that comfort. And I think that that's where you mentioned about trust again, is that, you know, the leaders are the ones that maybe have so much more control to be able to design and allow, I'm using that word, but and that's part of the point, is it's such a different world. Like I just need to know what my role is,
Yeah.
what are my skill sets, my strengths, how am I contributing to the vision of the organization? And so allow I keep saying allow, and I'll have to work on that. We can have a little session on words and things like that later,
Yeah.
because again, I've grown up in it for so long. So, but to be able to feel that you can contribute and it doesn't matter what the location. I just am to me, sometimes these things seem so simple. It's like, why is it so complicated? So,
And again, it
um,
goes back to that mindset. It's complicated because people don't want to let go of their understanding of how the world works, right? And like I've told people, like if you think of an executive leader or an executive team, and the way that they've always made decisions is in person, because they value seeing people, they buy into the fact that you can't have a productive conversation unless you can see body language, and here's how somebody breathes. um, they are going to have a really hard time recasting their expertise, right? Because their stories of success are always going to be based in, this is what it used to be like, right? And how do you reframe your narratives of success, right? Well, I met with this person. We went to the restaurant at 7 o'clock at night while my wife looked after the kids, and all of the things that are important get done offline. They don't actually even happen in the office. Well, that's not the reality of how things are happening right now. And we've done this for years now, right? So, for people who have a certain mindset and worldview, it's more comfortable to go back into what they're most familiar with because that's how they've always done it.
yeah.
And they don't
It,
want to let that go. Because it's a perception of letting go of power and control.
I love this conversation. It's it's interesting to me when I think back of my corporate experiences about that constant, this is the way we've always done it, which many people have, if they do have ideas or want to, be more progressive. And so it's sort of interesting. So I'll share this one story because I love it. When you think about success and all of our, accomplishments, and it's like maybe society just, well, that's more successful. But one of the things I'm most proud of when I worked at CIBC in the bank, I went from a legal career over into HR and I managed a team. We did most of the most complex employee relations issues, escalated team dysfunction or harassment or discrimination investigations, and just an amazing team. I learned so much from them, and I was looking to hire someone, and we're right across Canada. That was before they actually opened any international locations, and so there was one woman in mind. We had talked about it and she had said she would love to. And I was like, why is she not applying? I couldn't understand. So we had a chat and she said, well, I'm in Ottawa. I was in Toronto. And, you know, I would need an office and all those things. And I said, well, we just create one in your home or something. Like, I didn't even question it. I thought it was so interesting. Anyway, we still had to go through the formal process. There's panel interview, there's lots of process at the bank, but it's to create equity and fairness. She was the successful candidate in the end, and I just really also wanted to support her because she was a single mom. She had two kids at home. She was like exhausted, less like with all the commuting into Ottawa downtown. We created a small office within her home. it was $2,000 or $3,000 back then to create this place with a lock on the door to consider all the privacy issues and everything. Her life was so much calmer,
Yeah.
and she was an amazing, amazing, team member and did fantastic work, and it didn't matter because they traveled anyway sometimes, and so some of that, but there was also the ability to do remote work in an office in her home. So I thought, I didn't seek permission for that. I didn't even I didn't even think to say, "Hey," to the executive I worked with. I was a senior, quite a senior leader, but not at the highest level of the executives, um, and they no one cared. No one, like, I mean, I was lucky, maybe I had a leader that kinda got it, but, um, I was sort of a little bit of a rebel, I guess, back then. That's what we need. We need a few rebels in the workplace to say, "Hey, this can work," you know? So
Yeah,
I wanted to.
the challenge with doing stuff like that is when you talk about equity and fairness, what happens is other people get wind of those types of arrangements and they're on different teams, they have different leaders, they have different managers,
Mhm.
and they basically are told that they can't get access to that type of arrangements. And that's where equity and fairness becomes problematic. And
Yeah,
it's where you actually do need consistency and systems that support the flexibility, because
yeah.
otherwise, if some, like, honestly, it happened to me. The first thing I did when I was told no was like, okay, well, which team can I go to where I'm going to have that flexibility, where I can get that flexibility? And that's actually
Mm.
ended up how I moved from, because I was working for Manulife. I started at John Hancock, where I was dealing with American customers. They would only let me go to 4 days a week. And after I had an accident and shut down the DVP, made a million people late for work, I didn't want to commute anymore. So I wanted 100% remote. The only place I could get 100% remote was to actually go to a sales team for Manulife Bank. It happened to be located where I live, right? So you that's where you kind of have to look at what precedents you're setting, because again, those precedences um, affect trust.
Yeah, and I agree, and that was one of the other questions I had because in my view, it kind of still links to the discussion we had before we got on today, but and I
Mm.
was going to ask you about this in in designing, because the thing is there is still the policy, and who is impacted the most at, when you consider home and work and the challenges. And what happens is organizations often say, well, it doesn't matter, your job is here and that home stuff doesn't matter. And so now there's a lot more blending, and I think that that's happened over the pandemic. So and believe me, I'm all about, in hindsight, you can look at that and say, yes, did I create an inequity, or did I start something new? Because I actually also
Oh,
manage the
yeah,
work life program. But that
yeah,
was the point, is it can be done. And
you can.
so there is, the process.
Yep.
Okay, create a process for, because you remember in back then, all the work life, you had to put in an application
Oh,
sort of
yeah,
thing and get
absolutely.
approvals, and so
It's
there is
completely different.
process around it, but it was just a little bit more unique in that, I think that there wasn't as much working from home back
There
then. It's
wasn't.
so fascinating to me. And
There
so
wasn't.
there's a
And
lot.
quite honestly, in a large part, it was related to the technology, right? Because like
Yes.
when I started in 2011, we had we did not have a lot of the supports that we needed to have it in place. And that's why we started with a pilot of 1 day a week. We didn't even have phone support when we first started because the technology couldn't support it. It took us a lot of time and investment to get to the point where we could actually operate like we did in the office,
Yeah.
right?
And yeah,
And
and
so
even the
it's completely
pandemic.
different.
Yeah, and even the pandemic, like the one of my clients, they didn't also have a video capability yet.
Yeah.
So they had to, all of a sudden it's like, they were in the midst of working on it,
Yeah.
because those conference calls are harder sometimes when you're just listening and you can't read the body to interrupt it, like people talking, the facilitation. I mean, you have to learn that on video, but that really opened up the door for allowing this. And that's what I thought. So this all of the success, what I think was success in continue to operate for most companies, other than some manufacturing that they had to still go in. And why is it that we're feeling we need to revert back to the return to office? Like, what is the biggest driver of that? And I have other questions, and I hope anyone else that has a question can put it in. But what is the biggest driver of this return to office when we know
So
we've proven, I think we've proven the case for work anywhere?
yeah, and that's the thing. I'd argue that it actually does not matter how much proof you have when people are making these decisions. They're, as much as they want to be, tell everyone that they're data driven, they're not, because there's so much proof that sustains and supports the case for flexibility and happiness and keeping your employees um, satisfied, really helps the bottom line, right, of your company, right? So I'd argue that it's not really factoring into the decisions. So you have to look at the systems that are at play. So stepping out of mindset and worldview is, if you have an office, that's real estate that's worth something right now. Is it going to continue to be worth something? Maybe not, because if you look at a lot of the research and how this is going to play out in terms of, commercial real estate value in like 10, 15, 20 years, that's going to be a lot of eroded equity. And again, understanding that people, especially in Canada, are very real estate centric, to really divorce yourself from the narrative that commercial real estate is more of a drain than it is an asset. That takes a real rewiring of systems and values. And that is a major um, concept that's really affecting how people make decisions, because it's not just the CEO, right? It's not just the executive leadership team. You have boards who also, especially if you're in a public company, who are advising the executive leadership team, right? And if you think about who sits on boards, these are people who have been successful, really remarkably successful. They have investments, and especially in Canada, you're going to find that these people are the types of people who would have significant real estate investments. So for them to choose something that is not necessarily going to support the narrative of real estate being a key part and parcel of how the world of work functions, that's challenging.
Oh, yeah. And it reminds me of some things I had heard, sort of when things were clearing and people were returning to office. And all of a sudden, some larger companies, their IT function. So
Mm,
and a lot of technology folks are have been remote 100%, most of them.
yeah,
And
yeah,
I worked for a large tech company as well, and same thing with some of the financial institutions, that they were starting to force, and I'm going to say the word force here because
yeah,
that was the reality,
it is.
to come back. And it's like, well, to me, I'm wondering if that, like, my legal background would say, isn't that constructive dismissal anyway? So, like, they probably,
Oh, it's a good
have a pretty
chance.
good case to say
Yeah.
they want, but they also want to keep their job because they have,
Right.
families to feed, mortgages, everything else. But that real estate um impact, some companies, they have these brand new buildings for entire organizations, or they've invested
Or
in
they have a
training
100-year-old
facilities.
buildings, right? Like the company that I work for has massive real estate ownings on Bloor Street in Toronto. If they've owned it for over 100 years, it's part and parcel. It's woven into the fabric of what the company is, right?
Yeah.
So how do
Yeah.
you step away from that history and restructure the whole narrative of what the company is
Yeah.
and what they stand for?
Yeah. So I just thought of another question, and we didn't really chat about this before. So hopefully that's okay, because
Oh, of
I
course.
wanted to look at it from the generational perspective.
Yes.
Even though I, like you, a lot of times I'm trying to get away from, labeling, and, but there's reality issues in, like, I think it's 5 or 6 generations in some cases still, right?
Yep.
But Do you think that, because I find it interesting because my daughter's, was in the workplace. She's gone back to school now to do a
Mhm.
master's, but she was for a couple of years and majority was remote. And so do you feel that there is, and there's likely the studies that I haven't dug into lately, that support like the differences of expectation depending on the demographic in this whole hybrid remote? Or do you feel that it's individual why
So
people would want it?
I do think that it really comes down to especially in terms of how the generations function. I mean, every generation has similar life patterns, right? So no matter who you are, you're going to be born, you're going to go to school, you're going to grow up, you get into a relationship, you move out of your parents' house, maybe at some point, and you become independent in some manner of function, right? And then you start maybe having children or exploring children, or and then eventually you work, you retire, and that's generally how it's gone. So when you look at the generations, it's like, it's not so much that the younger generations are different than anybody else. I think we should focus on the commonalities, right? So what are the commonalities that people are experiencing? Well, kind of started with the millennials, in terms of the fact that real estate got so expensive that next step of, going to school, moving out of your parents' house, getting your own job, and then becoming independent, having kids of your own, that became really hard to do, right? And I think that's continued with my kids' generation as well too, right? My daughters will say to me, like, I don't know how I can ever afford to have a house based on the way things are right now. So everything is being delayed. Well, what does that mean in terms of how they're going to function and how they perceive work from home, for example, or remote work in general? Are they going to continue to live at home and want to work remotely? Well, do you want to stick around with your parents all the time? Like, that probably isn't going to change, because that's a very common thing that's basically hardwired, I think, into the human experience. Well, I mean, my kids have told me that they would rather work in person, right? Even though they've been exposed to me wanting to work from home. I think that the short answer is it's going to depend on where you are in your life, right? So you may find, um, like when you're in school, when you first start your job, you don't necessarily want to work from home because you just don't have the uh, resources to make it work well for you, right? Like, you might move into a small apartment, you have multiple different roommates, you might not have privacy to be able to function well and actually work well, because you just don't have the space and to devote to actually like a good workspace. You might not have access to co-working spaces, whatnot, right? So it's easier for you to go to an office and it's a better work experience, right? As you start changing, where you live, what you want to do, what your work is, you might change your mind. And I think that's really where, if we're looking across generations, you might find that people make different decisions about how they want to work and where they want to work based on their life experiences, right? You think about us, right? My kids are in university, my daughter's in grade 12. I'm at the point where I've had more flexibility in my life. I don't have to be home for my kids anymore. I have to be home for my dog. Right? But I technically could take off like Helen has today, take my dog with me, and everybody would be fine. I could work anywhere, right? Um, and I think that's what you're finding as well too, is like people who are staying longer and longer at work because people are living longer, so that's expensive. A lot of people are choosing to work longer. Those people, I think there's a perception that those people might want to go back into the office. That's not necessarily true, right? They may decide that they want that flexibility to, embed work within their life more so than anybody like who was engaged in traditional retirement, right? So that's what I think the magic is about the generations, is we really have to consider life experience and look at ways to personalize that across a career. That's where I think the competitive edge is for companies, personally.
Yeah, and that really does link to that flexibility
Yeah.
in and not a one size fits all policy program design, so to speak, right? That's where I I still want to dig into a little bit more on this like the self
Yep.
trust, because it's one of those things that so I had the employment law background, then the HR, and it's like you got to create policies. And like your point is there exceptions to policy? Does that create inequity? It is not easy. And I guess that's why we're still here today talking about these issues, because I think that it still connects to how do you trust your people to
Yeah.
make the right decisions and not be, slacking off or whatever the perception is, right? So that because I think that the point is like if some people, if their work product, so to speak, isn't great, then they're right away a manager is going to assume they need to be in the office. I need to see them. Where maybe it's a completely different issue. So I guess yeah, sorry, I rambled there a little bit, but I really am thinking about this is how my mind works.
Yeah.
There's a lot in there. Um, Linking it to trust still, and how would like if you were to go in and advise an organization, what advice would you give them to start to create this type of amazing environment where trust is a given?
So my guideline really is you start with trust. And if you start with trust, you earn more trust. And especially if you're considering like the reasons that people do work from home. So, you're a caregiver, you might have disabilities, you might have caregiving, like elder care responsibilities, right? There's a multitude but during the pandemic, what people were also discovering is that working from home is really good for managing systematic oppression. So like racism and sexism and all kinds of abuse that we know happens in the workplace, right? So if you start thinking about that and designing for um, the best possible employee experience, what I encourage people to do is don't start with a mindset of being tightly controlled and then making exceptions, because each exception just is a point of friction. It's far better to trust and design to be most inclusive. And then if you have to tighten up, then you do it for those individuals who aren't performing, right? So because you think of somebody who has ADHD, or they get into hyper focus because they're on the spectrum, right? And they're capable of producing work. They forget to eat, they forget to sleep, they just concentrate on doing work, and they are capable of getting work done that would take any neurotypical a week, but they can get it done in 2 days because that's just how their brain works. Well, what's their reward there? Do they get more work? Or because they've completed their task, do you call it a day and say, okay, take the rest of the week off to rest because you've been able to produce at such a high level that you're leaving the rest of us in the dust, right? Up until now, the response has been you have to earn your time. Whatever you did extra, that's on you. And too bad, so sad, right? There's been a default for the majority of organizations that I'm familiar with where, you know, if you're not working the way that we've always worked, then that's extra work. Thank you for your donation, right? We appreciate it, but you still have to show up and do the rest of the week, right?
Yeah, that is so true.
Right.
Wow.
So if you're designing to be more inclusive and have fewer situations where you have to actually take action for people who slack off, that's a better situation for everybody, right? Because then you're actually dealing with the people who take advantage of uh, the design, right? And not the majority of people who actually want to show up and do good work. And that is the majority, right? People like to be helpful, they like to be useful. The majority of people I've ever worked with aren't necessarily taking advantage of what's available to them. I've always come across people who are giving more than they're ever paid for, right?
Mm, I think
I know there's
that's
a couple of questions in the chat
true.
here.
Yeah. So I was just going to say we'll open it up for questions if anybody has any. And I'm
Yes.
curious if Aisha has any insights also from any of her research. So Claudine, do you think it would be good to set expectations and trust them to do the job, but hold them accountable?
Yes, I agree.
Yeah.
So I think that again, it's I think there's an onus on the organization to be more transparent than the employees, right? So set the expectations, explain. I actually am in the process of designing a structure for hybrid remote, and I actually published part of it yesterday. I'm calling it ACIT. And so it's accountability, commitment, and explanation, right? So you're designing a policy, you're explaining it, you're committing to it. You're not changing it all around, right? You're testing it out before you actually go live. You're tweaking it and individualizing it, and you're the so yeah. So the next part is integrity and or intention and trust. Are you designing with intention? Are you operating with you know good intentions? And are you trusting your people? That's really
Oh,
what
I
it comes down
love
to.
that. That
Yeah.
sounds like a wonderful framework, ACE it.
Ace it.
And
Yeah.
I think that's a great, and because that's, I mean, there's dialogues happening, but to put things into practicality is what often is the challenge, right?
Yeah.
And and I think that like creating the flexibility in design too,
Yeah.
to then co-create like what's working, what's not, what's and have the open communication and transparency about it. I mean,
Right.
so many times we think back and we take a look at all of these. I mean, everywhere there's thought leadership and people designing, it's like, but why has it been so difficult to have this in place? And I
Well, a
think
lot of
that
it comes down to what your expectation of productivity is, right? And so, and meaningful work, right? So there's been a tendency to really just add and add and add. Like I had conversations with my employer that my workload was so intense. There were days I was getting up and started working at 3 o'clock in the morning and working until 10 o'clock at night. And the only reason that I stopped was because the system shut down. Thank goodness, right? Because at least that way I could sleep without any guilt, right? But
mm,
when I talked to them about the fact that that was not a sustainable workload, that was put then on back on me going, you're not efficient. Well, no, I'm probably actually the most efficient person that you got. When I actually finally left, it took 14 people to replace me.
wow, wow.
So
Oh, wow.
this is what I'm talking about with self-trust. I knew I was doing good work. I knew that I was taking
Mm,
appropriate steps. I was adapting how I could. I was delegating what I could. I was asking for help. I was doing everything I knew how to do. And if I knew everything to be true and it was still a problem that was systematic, well, then an individual can only do so much against a system that refuses to change, right? And
yeah.
like I said, I got to the point where I was so burnt out, I had a car accident, nearly died. And their response when I asked to go remote was no. I'm like,
Oh
okay,
my
I nearly
gosh.
died, and you're still saying that that's not enough.
Oh,
That's
yeah.
where
And I
people walk
mean,
away. I walked away.
yeah, and that's the thing. It's, and it's sometimes difficult when you are in that environment, in that system, that no matter what you as an individual try to do, it's
Yeah,
nothing's going to change.
yeah,
And I mean, we haven't had a ton of talk about the systems, and we know though that the way that work is designed historically, it has to change, and that the systems, all of the institutions, schools, workplaces, government, like until they actually are unraveled and created in a different way, we are up against well, like colonialism, all of the things that come with oppressive systems, so we didn't have a lot of time to get into that. That could be part two of the discussion maybe next time. Oh, Aisha raised her hand. So, I mean, I think that the work you're doing is amazing. I do want to have a chance to, oh, Aisha, if you want to, you can unmute,
Yeah.
or come on out and ask your question. Go ahead.
Yeah, so thank you, Nola and Helen. So all these are very interesting conversation that I am having, and this conversation is actually very close to my heart because my thesis actually focused on work from home, and I'm actually trying to explore that how work from home is impacting the workplace innovation through collaboration. So I'm still on my, I'm still in the middle of my research. So I still do not have the specific results with me, but yes, I'm very much hopeful that by next year I will be able to come to a conclusion. And all this conversation related to productivity and innovation. So recently I attended a debate at Rotman, and the participants at the debate, they were actually talking about this same issue, that if work from home, I mean, like, why are we going back to the office? This whole issue of RTO, that if that is only because of productivity, because we are again and again questioning the employee productivity. And here the concept is that I actually agree with Nola that there are like a lots of definitions of productivity, right? That we are not consistent in terms of the definition of productivity. Also, we are not consistent in terms of the definition of collaboration and innovation. So we are complaining continuously that the employees' productivity are reducing, but until now, none of the research has proven that employees' productivity is actually getting reduced because you are working from other place rather than the office, right? So there is no evidence, first of all. And then, you have this lack of trust.
Yeah, actually, Nick Bloom, if you follow him, he's a Stanford professor. He actually just published a study of trip.com today, and he went through 2 years worth of data. And again, that conclusion that he's come to a million times is that productivity is actually enhanced by 35%.
Yes, yes.
So that was just something he published this morning I shared.
Oh,
But the other thing
lovely.
is, my point about productivity is the fastest way to improve productivity is to reduce the workload. So all of the work that you're expecting these people to do isn't even really necessary, right? Like there were so many times I went back and I just stopped. Going back to Helen's point about stopping to ask permission, I inherited a lot of exceptions to policies, and I tested whether those exceptions were actually needed. Like there's one client who always wanted these reports run, and they had to be done quarterly. And when I inherited them, I was told that that was like life or death. And I just one day just stopped running them, and it took them 8 months to notice. And I'm like, okay, but when they finally did catch it, I'm like, I can produce them for you, no big deal. But I want you to explain to me why you didn't notice. And I use that then to negotiate with them and to basically say, you know what, you can get the majority of what you want through regular systems. And if it's critical, then I can focus on this, right? And it became a negotiation. You don't have to accept the way things have always been done because it's wasted work. The meetings before the meetings and the meetings after the meetings, right? Like if we look at the cost of actually meetings are burning people out like crazy, right? And it's not necessary the majority of the time, right? So the fastest way to produce and improve productivity wherever you work is to reduce what you're expecting people to do. Just subtract. And we have a tendency to add. Claudine, did you want to chime in?
Yeah, absolutely.
Just to add to what Nola is saying, I did the same thing too. When I was working as a store manager, they wanted us to create all these reports on Mondays, but it wasn't necessary because like every single week, the head office would send the reports to say what our sales were, how many hours we use per week and stuff like that. So it wasn't really necessary, but yet every Monday morning, they wanted us to create that same report from the store level. But if you're getting it from head office, why do you need it, right? So I
I
stopped
don't.
creating it. I stopped
Exactly. That's
doing it,
right.
and they didn't even realize I stopped doing it, right?
Yeah.
Because they didn't really need it. Like they're given so much task, like too much workload when you could, focus on different aspects of the business,
Yeah. And
actually.
automation is really going to change things as well too. I actually
Mhm.
Yeah.
challenged a process for 10 years. We had busy work that was related to just avoiding duplicates. And it wasn't until we could automate it that that went away. And I saved like so much time because it just disappeared overnight because of automation. So when we start thinking about productivity and mastery and meaningful work, how is this going to change if we factor in automation and AI? And what does that mean in terms of how we're expecting value from employees? Is it really going to be every minute that you work from 9 to 5 and getting the max amount of work out of that? Or is it going to be, how do we work smarter using AI as like an assistant to really help us clear out time so we can do what humans do best, and that's be creative and to actually truly be innovative, not innovation theater, right? Those are the interesting things and the possibilities that get me really excited.
Oh, that's wonderful. I love that because I think that is, I think it's really important to question why things are being done a certain way. And absolutely, like here's one of the things. If you have capacity, I remember one VP I worked with who said, "Oh, Helen, you can work as much as 5 people." And I thought, "Oh, I don't know, maybe that's not a good thing because then it's like, okay, what's next? Give it to Helen." And that's the thing, but that in hindsight, I have the same thing. There's this capacity, I can go, but then I've got to like, okay, that's all I can give.
Right.
And
That
I
is that
can't work on Friday.
non-promotable work, right? And
Yeah.
that's the risk that a lot of women run is, they absorb, they have capacity, but the work that they're taking on is work that is truly not
Mhm.
recognized and valued, and essentially it's non-promotable.
Yeah.
Like you think about ERG work, right? I did a lot of it as well. I actually founded an ERG for family when the pandemic started, and I mean it wasn't paid. And honestly, when I was restructured, they offered me a different job as going back to constructive dismissal. And I think they thought that I would accept it and stay because I valued the volunteer work so much. But it's like, yeah, no thanks. That's not going to work for me, right? Because it's
Yeah.
work that is incredibly valuable in terms of, creating a place that's good to work at, because you're getting feedback from employees who are doing that work every day and who are willing to step up and say, this is what we need. But if that work is truly not valued and implemented and then rolled out actually across the organization to really make a difference on the day-to-day work, then that's wasted work.
Yeah. Um, we only have a couple minutes left and I want to be mindful of everybody's time. Um, I don't know if we might have to have a part 2, as I said, but because we did talk a little bit about like, how does this all link to psychological safety?
Mm.
And, I don't know if it'll do it justice in like 2 minutes, but we can, continue a little bit longer, but, parting thoughts on that.
So
Because it's
psychological
linked in
safety.
my view, but I
Yeah,
just,
so psychological safety is really related to trust and respect, right? And psychological safety does not necessarily mean that there are never any hard conversations. What it means is you can have difficult, challenging conversations without fearing repercussions, right? That's really what it comes down to. And when you've got, um, you know, groups and you're trying to create community to get feedback from employees, and you're talking about the return to office mandates, and all of those mandates are coming out saying, basically you comply or we're going to fire you, automatically you do not have psychological safety, right? You don't, because you don't feel safe, you don't feel trusted, you don't feel respected, right? Because there's like a consequence, like a severe consequence that comes to actually even questioning that mandate. And you're not co-creating with your employees, you're trying to instill fear, and you're shutting down conversations. And that truly, when you look at the organizations who are implementing all of these mandates, even if you look at like the federal government in Canada, they have big problems when it comes to their relationships with their employees, because they're just stepping on the communication channels and destroying psychological safety.
Yeah. Wow. We could probably be talking about this for days.
Yeah.
And maybe we will piece it out and have a panel. And Aisha, I'm looking forward to see what your research, because I also want to explore a little bit in the future, like the gender, the discussion and linking to gender, and
Yeah.
is there, additional challenges, which I think there are, but anyway, that's because of the roles that women take at home and in the workplace. And even it kind of links to those volunteer roles, right? The expectation of who's doing the extra. It can be a fascinating continued discussion. So before we, Aisha mentioned that she's going to be looking also at the role of gender. So we'll look forward to that. I'll have to have you on one of the mentor circles in the future as well. But I just want to take the time to say, oh, thank you so much, Nola. Every time I chat with you, it's amazing. I'm learning more. Where can people reach out to you if they want to continue conversations or find out more about your work? Where's the best place to find you?
Well, I'm happiest on LinkedIn, if you want to reach out to me on LinkedIn, but I am actually on every platform going. So Threads, Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok. TikTok, if you want to check out today, I actually had a recent article published about my career in Maclean's magazine, and because of the Meta shutdown, they're promoting it on TikTok. So today I have a TikTok that was actually just published on Maclean's magazine on TikTok. I shared it on
Oh
my
my
own
gosh.
profile, but
I'll admit I'm not on TikTok. Maybe I should be, but
well, I posted on LinkedIn and on
I can't
Instagram
wait
just
to see
to
that.
share it. But it's kind of
Oh.
funny because I recorded it all on a green screen, and then they edited all the
Mhm.
background, and I'm like on the like behind me there's this whole shot of like the 401 and peak rush hour, and I'm like, oh, this is so cool. I don't know how you did that, but I really
Oh,
like
wow. Well, you
so
are
that
a
was fun.
breath of fresh air. I'm so grateful for you to share some of your wisdom today and your thoughts on this. I know that we could probably speak for hours. The last thing, you have a podcast, right?
Yeah.
Where can people go to find that? And I will send out a note after, and can share some other resources that mention the summary. I'll for those who are here and who signed up. And this will be out there too if you want to, there's lots of great information. But where did they find the podcast as well?
So I mean, honestly, you can find everything on my website, which is nolasimon.com, but on any podcast app, so Apple, Spotify, Good Pods, it's all there. But it's called Hybrid Remote Center of Excellence, and I really do feel that the more we talk about the future of work, the more we collaborate, the more we talk about the issues, and stand up for what it is that we want to see. Part of why I do what I do is because I wish a better working experience for my children, right? And so it benefits us, it benefits our children. And what does this look like 10 to 15 years from now, right?
Yeah.
So that's really what the podcast is about. It starts with hybrid remote, but it's really future work and how we co-create.
Yeah. Well, I can't wait to see what comes up and share more in the future. Look forward to learning more about the ACIT approach. And
I have to write it.
thank you also to everyone that showed up today. I really appreciate everybody coming. And I hope to see you again soon. And so have a wonderful day, and thank you again. All right. Have a great day, all.
Thanks, Helen. Bye, everyone.
Bye.